Brazil's presidential election between incumbent Jair Bolsonaro, who is known as the Trump of the tropics, and Lula da Silva will go to a second round because unfortunately, Lula da Silva, the leftist candidate, did not receive a majority of the votes, meaning more than 50% in order to avoid a second round. Now, while some progressives in Brazil are disappointed by this, Lula da Silva is just undeterred, defiant, and excited to continue campaigning to basically win this election, and I certainly hope he does. Here are the percentages. With more than 99.5% of votes counted, the leftist veteran, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, had secured 48.3% of the vote, not enough to avoid the October 30th runoff with rival Jair Bolsonaro. My understanding is they don't call it a runoff, they call it a second round, but you guys get the picture. In the US, we would call it a runoff. Nonetheless, Bolsonaro, who significantly outperformed pollsters' predictions and received 43.3%. Now, the polls did indicate that Lula da Silva had a massive lead over Bolsonaro. I think the reason why you see some disappointment among progressives in Brazil is that they did not expect a second round to need to happen. And leading up to the election, you have the Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro, essentially spouting the same election fraud lies that Trump had spewed prior to the 2020 presidential election. He had also implied that he wouldn't step down or accept defeat if he lost the election, essentially setting up a similar scenario that we have been experiencing here in the United States with Trump refusing to concede. But what I will say is, after the election over the weekend, showing that there would need to be a second round and that the pollsters overestimated the support for Lula da Silva, Jair Bolsonaro, shockingly, not questioning whether there was election fraud in this presidential election, John.
That is funny, but I've seen a couple statements from him that imply that there was still fraud, actually. I mean,
really?
One would think it's impossible to maintain that fiction, not only when you haven't been knocked out, so you have another chance, so there's not as much of an incentive to imply that the entire thing was fake, but also the fact that you did better than the polls indicated. Now, of course, they're gonna say that that's proof that the polls were lies, but that isn't proof that the electoral system is secure. The fact that he did even better. And if you were to ask them, why are all the polls lies? Because that's what he says in the same way that Trump and Republicans say that here, that all the polls are lies, despite the fact that they're conducted by many different organizations independently, they're all lies. Why? Well, it's to maintain this fiction that he has no support so that they can steal the election and it'll look like it makes sense. So why didn't they steal the election then? Why didn't Da Silva get 60% of the vote, 55% of the vote? Why? They don't have any answer. How is it exactly that they're doing all this coordination? And how is it exactly that the challenger is able to rig the vote in all of these disparate counties rather than the president, who would theoretically have more capacity? None of this makes any sense. And it doesn't matter if it's in Brazil or if it's in the US, if it's in Russia, the arguments are all the same. They're all nonsensical, except in that they're designed to appeal to people who have a victim complex. When you train your supporters to believe that the other side are the absolute worst, they'll do nothing to not lose, or there's nothing that they won't do to not lose, then you'll believe anything. You don't have to make rational arguments. And so that's what we're seeing. But bear in mind, he's going to continue to assert that you can't trust the vote, even if it allowed him into the second round, because he needs to keep the option of saying it just in case in the second round Da Silva does win.
Right, and look, Lula da Silva does have a significant lead over Jair Bolsonaro. So the chances of him winning the presidential election, winning the second round, pretty high chances, right? And Lula knows that, which is why he remains defiant. He didn't, get disappointed, or at least didn't show that he was disappointed. He said, following the results of the election, quote, "The struggle continues until our final victory. We are going to win these elections. This for us is simply extra time." I mean, the man is incredible, not only due to the policies that he had implemented when he was the leader of Brazil. He lifted tens of millions of Brazilians out of poverty. He was doing really well in the previous presidential election, and the reason why he didn't win is because he was made a political prisoner by Bolsonaro and the judge who was working with Bolsonaro to essentially throw Lula da Silva in prison for these like trumped up nonsense corruption allegations. That was thrown out eventually, which is why he's able to run in this election. But when he was casting his ballot, when Lula was, he made a point about that, about how good it felt to be able to vote, because in the previous election, he didn't have the ability to. He was thrown in prison because he was made a political prisoner. So it would clear the way for Bolsonaro to be the leader. But I wanna go back to a quick point you made, John. I think it's an important one about this conditioning of victimhood, right? Conditioning people to see themselves as victims when they're not. It is amazing how well that works, how easy it is to propagandize people into thinking that they're somehow being screwed over, or they're somehow victims because of their political ideology. A good example is, conservatives here in the United States constantly talking about how they're censored, how leftists won't have conversations with them, how they won't be debated because we're always running away from them. They will make that argument like as they're on progressive or leftist shows. It's like, it's amazing. And there's no stop in that line of thinking, even as there's a contradiction slapping them in the face,
Yeah, no, 100%. And for some, it's to train them to think of themselves as victims when they're not. Like think middle class or wealthy Republicans that believe that them being white is the worst handicap ever, and they're being like, that's absolute nonsense. And then there's taking people who are actually victims of a variety of different things, very poor conservatives potentially, and convincing them that they're a different sort of victim. That it's not their economic problems really that need to be fixed. It's something else, something that doesn't challenge the economic status quo. What's been interesting about this, the election in Brazil, because I've been following a great episode of John Oliver's show, breaking it down last week. I've been tracking some of what Bolsonaro's been saying and everything. And all too often, I feel like for a very long time, people are not upfront about their lack of expertise about the politics of different countries, because different countries are different political histories, different political cultures. I'm not an expert on Brazil, I'm simply not. And yeah, I've noticed that it seems to matter less these days. If you listen to Bolsonaro, if you see his speeches, it sounds exactly like what you could say Trump, or you could say DeSantis or Tucker Carlson are saying. It's the same exact boogeyman. And honestly, Vladimir Putin had his big speech just a few days ago. He was talking about literal Satanism and the transgender community and everything. Like in the same way that like fast food franchises have made every town in America kind of the same, like boneheaded, primal, pathetic conservatism has made the politics of so many countries seemingly the same on the surface at the very least.
No, absolutely. And the reason why they go to their endless talking points about transgender people or whatever is because they want any distraction, any scapegoat for the pain and suffering they cause by colluding with corporate interests to essentially rob their own constituents. Yep. And it's disgusting because at the end of the day, everyone gets screwed. The only people who come out winning are the corrupt politicians and the corporations they serve. In the communities they target get demonized, harassed, targeted, and the rest of the population who gets fooled into believing these narratives get robbed. It's just, it's so wrong. And the other thing I wanted to just quickly mention is this is such a critical election because it's not just about Brazil, it's about what Bolsonaro is doing to the indigenous community there, what Bolsonaro has done to the Amazon with the endless logging that's been taking place, just destroying the Amazon rainforest. And he seems to have absolutely no regard for democracy. And I think that was already evident in what he did to his political opponent in the previous presidential election. But we'll keep an eye on this. As I mentioned, the second round will take place October 30th. And I really do hope that Lula da Silva keeps up with this momentum. He's an incredibly inspiring person, and this would be incredible news. Lula winning would be just a massive win for not just Brazil, but for progressives and leftists across the globe.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.